Afternoon, Phil, and thanks for Dave setting me up there with some of the things that I'm going to elaborate on now. So it's great to be here to talk to you, and hopefully you're all still able to engage with my talk. Can you see this okay, Phil?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Brilliant. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the potential for AI-enhanced assessment and feedback. And I tend to always start these talks with just a reminder, and Dave, I think, hinted at that in his last remarks there, around sort of things that happen with assessment. And quite often, I think we forget about the fact that learners engage in tasks. And as Dave mentioned, these tasks don't always necessarily have to be summatively assessed. They might contribute to the learning process. And typically, as educators, we design these so that they can generate data not only for ourselves in terms of where students are currently at, but also for students to understand their current level of knowledge and understanding. And those can start to form evidence in terms of where students might take their learning journey. But later on, some of these tasks will build and can contribute towards those sort of final standardized elements that we have within our modules. So we're talking about the claims that we can make about our learning. And why I mention that is because a lot of these tasks can generate feedback. But as Dave mentioned, quite often our students expect feedback to happen all of the time and to be sort of attached to marked work. And one of the problems is that we set these tasks and students sometimes don't engage in those tasks. And as a practitioner, that's really frustrating because we've designed these in a way that allows students to incrementally build knowledge, understanding, try things, experience failure, experience setbacks, and learn, and also so that there's some feedback generation that can have an impact. What also happens, though, is students expect, once they've done that work, is that it is marked. And one of the problems with that is not only is the fact that not all work that students do in their experience should be marked, but they expect us to do something with it. It expects us to be the ones that mark it. And that's a problem, not only because of workload and time challenges, but just the sheer logistics of us marking iteratively across a module that perhaps has 400 or 500 students, for example. So the problem is that we continue to perpetuate this element of feedback being attached with marked work. And what I'm going to suggest today is how we can think about the challenges of workload and the tasks that we set and how feedback and feedback exists within the learning environment, and how AI might help us with some of those challenges as we navigate the workload issue. So feedback is probably one of the most important parts of a student's experience. When you talk to them, they always say, you know, I need feedback, I want feedback. However, the evidence across the last 30 or 40 years suggests that students don't always understand the language. They don't collect feedback. Probably often that's something that we were more consciously aware of when feedback was perhaps on written scripts that was in our offices. Now it's online, but if you have a look at how much your students look at the feedback that you give, it doesn't always equate to 100%. And a lot of that is because, as Dave mentioned earlier, it's attached to perhaps assessment that is at the end of a module. There's no necessarily a landing place for it to have an effect, or it comes too late in the process.
Ed, sorry, can I just stop you just very, very quickly? We're just going to share your slides if that's okay, because the presentation view we've got, some people are finding it quite small to see the slides. So if you just carry on talking, we can share the slides this end for you.
Okay, you're going to take me off the thing, are you?
Yeah.
Can I just see if I can change something? Because I think I might have, is that better?
It's still the same at the moment. I think it's the split screen.
Yeah, let me try and share this in a different way. Is that better, Phil?
Yes, that is better. Yeah, thank you, Ed, and sorry for interrupting me.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I changed the settings slightly so I could see you. Yeah. So myself as an educator and researcher in feedback, the fact that students don't use feedback is probably the most frustrating thing. And I think there's a couple of things going on here. Is that we continue to do the same thing and expect a different result, i.e. we give our students lots and lots of feedback after they've completed work. Very frustrating, and we don't get a different result. But also students don't necessarily see where they may be able to use feedback or don't appreciate the feedback that is all around them. And what we know from this study and countless others is that students want specific, understandable and actionable feedback, which is not so much of a difficult thing to understand. We probably as educators expect that ourselves. The thing is, they expect it prior to submission. And this is a problem for us in terms of workload, as I mentioned. So how can we think about feedback, particularly today, during the process? And this is what I really want to focus on. What happens during the process of a module or a program of study where we can really affect the use of feedback? And I'm going to suggest some ways that AI might be able to help us with that. So normally when I do these talks, I talk about the two on the left here. We talk about formal feedback because that's what people are very used to. They think about the institutional policies, the turnaround, and people get obsessed with that. But I want to move us towards the right-hand side of the slide, particularly around peer feedback and the challenges that peer feedback presents, and how some educators that I speak to say, oh, well, I can't possibly do peer feedback. But also these two on the right here, the informal and internal feedback, and whether AI will increase the propensity or the opportunity for informal feedback, but also the idea that internal feedback can be generated from students' interactions with AI. So some of the issues with peer feedback, and there's lots and lots of study around peer feedback in terms of actually how you might do this, although it's got a huge benefit for students in terms of the way that it helps them to understand the judgments that they make and how they are able to assess each other in terms of the quality of the work that people are producing, one of the key skills that we expect graduates to have. Students are generally more happy when they are anonymous and online in commenting on their their peers' work. And also when it's face-to-face, they're less critical in terms of their tone because they don't want to upset people. So one of the ways that we're starting to think about feedback in a different way is the use of AI and how that can sometimes be less of an issue around upsetting because it's not a human interface, but also the speed at which that feedback can be generated by the AI. So I'm going to propose a series of things now. But why I mention this is because of workload. If you set up peer feedback or peer assessment within your modules, there is a huge amount of workload. There's logistics, there's how you might reduce content and how you might bring students along, but also how you get students to consider the benefits of this. I hear very, very many times when I do talks around peer feedback and peer assessment, educators say students often comment the fact that, oh, well, you're getting us to do the work. And I think this is sometimes a misconception on students in that the old adage of you turn up to lectures and we'll teach you, the art of teaching is not just trying to pour information into students' brains. It's about active, it's about doing things. And as Dave mentioned in his talk before, students actively doing things with the material and making judgments about quality can improve the learning process. So can AI act as a peer? Can we use AI as an anonymous peer in the way that we have AI at the moment and how it's evolving? So I want to talk about ChatGPT, and I appreciate there are other AI out there, but most of my experience has been with ChatGPT today. Now, we know that prevention is probably not possible. We know that many universities around the world have suggested that we're going to embrace this. We're going to suggest how we can help students to understand how to use that. And I'm of the opinion that this is probably sensible. Prevention's not possible. Even the sort of software that purports to be able to detect the use of AI. I think OpenAI themselves have removed their chatbot today and said that they're not able to say it's 100% the efficacy of that. So we're not going to be able to prevent that. So many of our students are using it, and I suspect many academics are using it as well to help them in their daily working lives. So how can we harness that and use ChatGPT as part of the process? And I'm really interested in my research about the process, about how students use feedback during the process, where I would argue it has most effect upon their future learning behaviour and the quality of the work they produce. But what might that look like? So I've got a slide here. I'm going to work from left to right. And I think if we think about the way that students might engage with AI, is that firstly, people will probably think that AI can act as a comparator. So if we were to use students to compare each other's work, that can be quite difficult to do, and it doesn't immediately work, and it's time consuming, and I get that, and it's difficult to operate in large modules. But could students use ChatGPT to redraft their work. Could the student ask ChatGPT certain questions, specific questions about the work that they've generated? So they've created perhaps a draft piece of work and they input it into ChatGPT. ChatGPT might generate alternatives. Subsequent questions that the students input may end up changing the output or the alternatives that ChatGPT generates. So in a sense, that interface with the AI is responsive. It's responsive to the first input, but it's also responsive to perhaps the student going back and forth with modifications, whether that be modifications in terms of the questions that it asks the AI, or modifications in the work that the student is producing that it continually goes back and forth and inputs. And these dialogic exchanges in terms of written text or written form, these are ways that students can iteratively modify their work. Now, is the question I've got for you then, is what is generated, is that output feedback? Well, students would often say to us that feedback is written comments. It's comments that the educator writes on the piece of work that they do or the presentation. But the output that ChatGPT is suggesting, the modifications, the changes, that's feedback. And the student creating different prompts or modifying is a feedback loop. It's a feedback cycle. So can the student generate feedback for themselves based upon that process? Can they start to get a picture about where they are in their learning? Can they start to see the patterns that emerge if they make X or Y change to their work and how that changes the further work that they do? Is that an interaction that perhaps articulates the holy grail of feedback around it being timely? Because they're not having to wait for an educator's input. There's multiple iterations during the process. So students might actively engage with ChatGPT in a refinement or iterative refinement. But the question that students need to ask themselves when they go through this process is how good is the feedback that ChatGPT generates? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the quality of outputs in a moment. But being able to apprise the quality of the source and the output of the source is a skill that all of us need to have. We will have multiple sources of feedback in other areas of our lives and in our higher education existence. We're familiar with those oral delivery of feedback, perhaps from lecturers or peer feedback, but this is another input. This is another potential source of feedback. But we have to, whenever we receive feedback, is question the quality of the feedback. Is it what the sort of feedback that I can use? But also, how good is the feedback that the student is generating during this process? And this is a real skill in being able to understand the quality of feedback that students are generating for themselves. And this is emerging in this sort of, and I suspect David Nichols on the call today, in terms of internal feedback, that process of generating feedback for oneself. And I wanted to elucidate this a little bit more in terms of the way that generative AI might work more broadly in terms of how students interact with this, not just in internal feedback. So I think we have to introduce our students to ChatGPT. We have to train them. We have to get them to understand that this is another source. We can't just say, go off and use it. So I think there's an element on that in us helping students to engage with those sources, much like we would help them to engage with the written feedback that we could deliver or the oral feedback. So part of the feedback literacy framework, if you like, of helping students to understand and recognize feedback. We have to think about the ethics, the parameters, and the potential boundaries that exist within these large language modules that we have that are in existence, and we know that they're going to evolve over time. So we could either get students to generate the first draft with ChatGPT help, and I know there have been some discussions and some talks in previous webinars in this series, but we could also, as I mentioned earlier, get students to generate the first draft. So there's two ways, I guess, of students engaging with that. But the clear thing for me is this critical analysis of that first draft, being able to analyze the feedback and the quality of the work. And that's starting to get the process. It could also be aligned to comparison to exemplars that the educator may have already used within a module. They may have integrated that within the teaching time. And the clear learning on this process then is to reflect on that. What impact is that having? How is that affecting me as a learner in terms of my use of feedback? And I think we have to build these frameworks into the way that students understand and appreciate feedback and understand the use, so that they can then understand where they're moving forward in their learning and the power that feedback is having on them. Obviously, enacting feedback is something that we want them to do, and what I'm suggested in my talk here is that there is potential, because it happens within the process, so it can happen prior to submission of that final piece of work. But there's a redrafting process, and explaining how ChatGPT improved the process could be one of the ways that we say to students, we know you're going to use it, but how did that help you? How did that change what you did? Do you understand that? And building that into the assessment pattern so that we get students to appreciate the feedback inputs and the outputs that happen in terms of the feedback that they generated for themselves. So they have far greater appreciation of the role that feedback has in the improvement of their work. But also getting them to reflect on feedback that they may have rejected and why they rejected that. We don't talk a lot about how students reject feedback and why. Just because they haven't attended to it doesn't mean they haven't recognised it. They may have decided it doesn't actually fit their purpose. And again, that's part of becoming a lifelong learner, is thinking about the quality of the feedback source. So as I mentioned, in the assessment submission, you could have a section on feedback enactment. You could also have in-class discussions that relate to the different experiences that students have with using feedback from ChatGPT, and how that compares then to teacher feedback as well. What I'm not saying here is that this is completely going to replace the role of the educator. Of course, it is not. But what it is a potential further input source that students can utilise in the different feedback sources that are available to them. And I think at the end of this process, getting students to appreciate that there's lots of feedback inputs might be one of the ways that we start to get students to think of feedback differently than it just being, as I mentioned earlier, written comments at the end of a piece of work that the educator provides that they don't necessarily have to do much with. One other thing, and I'm conscious of workload, is that there's something else on the horizon when it comes to generative AI. And this is probably quite controversial. Teachers using ChatGPT for grading. Now, I wanted to put this in there because I wanted to have a discussion about this. So I thought this might generate some sort of discussion on the chat, or generate some conversations in your own setting when you leave the call. So there's potential benefits for what is being touted as an AI grading service. Now, the first one is obvious, it's time saving. We've got automated grading process, quicker feedback turnaround. But what we know about some of the AI grading services and the quality of the AI is that it might not necessarily be consistent enough. And we need to think about the quality of the student feedback. Is the generation of that feedback going to be the sort of quality and the consistency that we have? And I'm going to share that in a moment. But one thing it can do is potentially control marker fatigue. Many of you have probably in the last few months been through severe amounts of marking. I talk to colleagues all the time about this and how it's hard to consistently mark if you're, say, marking for 3 consistent weeks, and how you're able to apply criteria consistently and fairly to all students across that 3 weeks around fatigue. But also, as I mentioned, the area of workload and the pressure to turn around work really quick. And whether or not there is an element of controlling bias. And we've talked about bias within AI in other talks, but there's some worry around that. But these grading services are out there. But I wondered about the efficacy, and I thought, well, there must be a paper already about the efficacy of this. And lo and behold, what did I find? So this paper came out recently. It's a preprint that you've got here, but it is due to be out next month in Research Methods in Applied Linguistics. And they used one of these sources, and they trained the AI on a large corpus of essays that were previously scored by human markers. So these were older essays, they were work that had been marked. And what they got the AI to do was to learn the process of marking and the criteria, and look at patterns to predict the score of new unseen essays. So essentially it trained it and then said, what we want you to do is predict accurately with the human scores in these marks that we're going to input. So it automatically scored all 12,100 essays across 11 different languages, and it basically gave it low, medium and high. So quite a rudimentary grading criteria. I appreciate we have more nuance in ours. So it used the assessment criterion and rubric, and then randomly selected 1,210 essays for rescoring to assess the consistency of the initial scoring, and it performed really well. So this was the result. Now, the exact match was 54.33% accuracy. So on the face of it, you think, oh, crikey, that's not actually a brilliant score. However, if you think about the way that we mark as educators, and we have moderation or we have second marking, how many times do you hit on the nail the exact mark that another marker gave? It's probably not 100%. So what they did was say to the system, well, there's some slight leeway in the parameters, and we'll look at the efficacy of that. And when they looked at a 1 to 2 point variation, they got 89.15% accuracy and no cases of a 3-point difference. So we're talking really, really strong accuracy in terms of AI being able to mark aligned to how humans marked. Now, I'm not saying that this is the way that it should go, but what I'm saying is that there is a potential for software companies to utilize AI in order to create automated grading for even essays that we have mentioned here. So, some caution. AI is not perfect, and I think there's been countless talks. And if you go back to the YouTube on these talks, you'll see lots and lots of people saying that. One of the things I suspect has come up in the chat is around privacy, and I completely get that. Yes, absolutely. What happens to the work when it is uploaded to perhaps marking sites or ChatGPT or whatever it might be? Where does that sit? And that's one of the issues that I suspect we're going to uncover as we utilize this process. How do we ensure that we protect the data of our students? There will be accuracy concerns, and we know that it's not perfect and that won't always work. We're doing some emerging research at the moment that has worked on the accuracy of marking, a lot smaller than the example I gave. But I think there are potential opportunities for students to use it in a formative sense or on draft work, but we have to be cautionary about this. We have to educate our students about the outputs that ChatGPT and other AI produces and the quality, and being able to understand the limitations of the output, and that just because it comes up on the screen doesn't mean it's perfect, much like we would in terms of their critical analysis of sources that they engage with that are perhaps more familiar. And the key with all of this is the interpretation, the student's interpretation of the process and the outputs that the AI generates. That's the active learning part. And the feedback generation that either the AI generates or the student generates for themselves as they go through this process. And getting students to understand that internal feedback, I think, is a really strong avenue for us to consider about how they engage with that source, so that they're starting to question the feedback and, more importantly, think about how they might use that to improve their future learning. I'd welcome any questions that you might have, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Amazing, Ed. Thank you so much. There has been a lot of discussion and questions coming in during that talk. Lars has put his hand up, so whilst we're kind of looking through that, Lars, are you still able to unmute yourself? Just allow me to do that for you. Okay, you should be able to unmute your mic.
Right. Yeah, I'm just nodding away there as someone who teaches English Lit when you're talking about close reading and interpretation and critical thinking, because that's sort of the bread and butter of what we're trying to teach on the skills level sort of every day, and where I'm coming from. But what I'm really asking is about how you teach AI literacy, and what sorts of skills and training there might be available for doing that, because you know what you're suggesting. I mean, formative assessment I'm very familiar with. I used to be a school teacher before I was a HE teacher. It's very time consuming, and training students to critically use AI also strikes me as very time consuming in what is already a very crowded, you've got a short time to teach your content and all the rest. So yeah, any advice or resources for teaching AI literacy, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, I have, in terms of specific, Lars, I haven't got specific that you can go. All I'm suggesting here is this is the distance that we're traveling in terms of, if we have this software out there and we have students engaging with it, then it is going to be something that we have to help them to understand, much like we helped them when Google came around. And I remember the days when students were just thinking that because it was on Wikipedia, it was a perfect answer. That seems crazy saying that out loud now, but we've gone so far in 20 years. But I think it's another skill. But I think there's a problem with sometimes thinking that AI is perfect, or we know that it isn't. But on a surface level, people think because there's an input and an output, then the answer might be correct. And we as educators are using this on a daily basis and understand it, but maybe some of our students aren't necessarily understanding it, and they might use it quite superficially. And I think we have to sort of help them to appreciate the critical engagement with that as another source. But it could be potentially very powerful in terms of what it can do. But I think, you know, as users, we have to adapt to that. And as educators, if we're honest, we're only just starting out on this journey as well. We're probably only half a page further along in the book than they are. You know, we're as a race, we're trying to do that. So I think we have to appreciate that it's very early stages. So I'm sorry I haven't been able to specifically answer your question there, but I'm sure there will be things coming out soon.
That's okay. It's a complicated one, and I think one of the things we all need is sort of top level guidance from our universities about what the limits are, especially in terms of assessment and feedback, and that's really lacking at the moment. And I really hope that changes soon.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too controversial. I would always resist top level down stuff if at all possible.
But just as guidance.
Let's go for ground up.
I don't want to tell you how to teach, but just like where the line is.
Sure, yeah.
Lars, whilst I can't give you kind of any guidance at the moment, I can tell you that one approach that we're using at the University of Kent is that we're going for more of a collaborative approach using a number of different teams to help create some, I want to say training session, but it's kind of going to be an event really for students that will be starting at the start of term. And it's going to be kind of the e-learning team will be giving an introduction, and then we're going to be the library will be giving a talk on how students fact check information, and our student support team SLAS will be kind of taking students through kind of how they can avoid accidental kind of, or you know accidentally finding themselves in a plagiarism kind of situation. So it's going to be something which we're creating. I don't see why we wouldn't be happy with sharing the kind of the structure of those sessions once they're created, in the kind of the interest of sharing. But that's certainly one approach that we're going to be taking at Kent. Sorry, I had to jump in there.
Yeah, that sounds very good. It's just about like, how to get this information to students, absolutely. I suppose is the question.
We do have another question. Jill, you put your hand up. You should be able to unmute your mic now and ask Ed your question.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry. Thanks very much, Ed. Park the AI for just a second. I tried an assignment this past year similar to what you talked about, where I got the students to do a draft. I got them to do peer feedback, and they were doing a critically based argument, so drawing on evidence and so on and so forth. I found coming up with the grading criteria quite tricky. And then it was, because I did group, I was able to save there 130 students in the class. So it saved me work just because it was a group. And I wonder if you could just talk us through briefly how you manage the draft, the critique of the feedback, and then the redraft. How would you actually grade an assignment like that?
Well, I think you need to add that into the criteria, right? So, you know, in terms of the quality of what they've reflected on, how they've used it, whether they can identify in the particular piece of work the input that they had and the impact it had. So you can either tack it on to the end, or you could, which is generally what happens. People say, you know, they write a reflective element and you have to arbitrarily give some marks to that. That doesn't always feel integrated, really. I think it's part of the narrative, part of the story. Where I've seen it work really well, if you know, outside of the AI stuff, is in performance-based subjects where they've used feedback across the week, and it's more of a public act, so students can see how students have iteratively improved based upon the peer feedback they've had. But obviously some subjects don't publicly display the work in progress. You know, there's not an element where we say to students, well, bring along your draft work to the next session and we'll discuss it, and then you can show in the next subsequent weeks to your peers how you've used that feedback and how it improved. I think the performance things that I've done, music, drama, comedy, etc., have really showed how you can do that. And I think sometimes that's sort of seem radical in some subjects, that we share our work in progress for fear that people might copy our ideas and things. But I do think that process, certainly in that experience, helps students to see that feedback could be used and it could improve students' work, especially those ones that were skeptical about whether peer feedback would have an impact. And in most of those cases, the lecturer sort of would say, yes, that's really improved, and they would sort of note the quality of the peer feedback in subsequent weeks and say, yes, your peer said that had an impact on you. And so I suppose it's legitimizing the quality of the peer feedback as well, because students are sometimes skeptical about that. you know, and the source of the feedback, aren't they? They say, you know, they're not the expert. Why are they commenting on my work? But I think sometimes they're closer to it because they're doing it at the same time. Does that answer your question?
I think so, yeah. I mean, my experience this year was actually even though we did a lot of work on not being too sensitive in giving it and receiving it and so on and so forth, I was disappointed with the quality of the feedback the students actually gave, but it was all done at once. So I'll have to look on it for next year. But again, with 130 students in the class in this particular module, it's tricky enough to manage.
Yeah, I do think over time, the more opportunities they get to do it, the more critical they become. Yeah. It sort of breaks down that, I don't want to upset my friends. And some of those experiences I mentioned before, by the end of it, they were pretty, they didn't hold back. If anything, they went too far sometimes.
Yeah. And sometimes they didn't know enough to know themselves. They weren't picking up on the things that I was picking up on. So it's learning for me for next year. That's great. Thanks very much, Ed. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jill. We've probably got time for one more question. We've run about 5 minutes over, but I think we can allow one more question if that's okay, Ed. Dustin, you have your hand up.
Really interesting kind of discussion you just gave. It was more of a suggestion based upon what Lars was asking for. I was just wondering how many of you have created a community of practice in your universities where you can get students and staff to kind of share ideas. I found this really helpful for a different thing. If anyone's going for senior fellowship, for example, of HEA, it can be quite a daunting process, but this seems like the perfect opportunity to create a local one, or if you wanted to go bigger, go on Discord, so that you don't have to switch between teams. But have you thought of that, or are you doing that to kind of generate those conversations and to get people to help each other?
That might be one for you, Phil, on there.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to jump in there. So in terms of kind of the sharing practice, that was kind of one of the reasons why we've run this session. So we would like to use that as a starting point. We're happy to put on more of these style events where there's more kind of sharing and maybe have more of a Q&A or a discussion type session instead of the usual webinar format. We're more than happy to do that. In terms of the University of Kent, we are also looking into to doing this as well. So we're in the early stages of setting up an AI kind of working group where we'd be bringing in kind of key stakeholders from each divisions, but also we'd like to bring in students into those conversations as well, because we very much would like to work collaboratively, with students going forward. We've also got kind of informal groups that have been set up by the library around this as well, which we run on Teams internally. So we run that. But, you know, if there's a call for creating a kind of community around specifically AI and people would like to do that, then please reach out to me. I'm happy to kind of look into how we could set that up as a kind of a spin-off from the webinar series if people find it useful. We've got such a great community here with so many people. I think we're now over 8,500 members. So it would be really, I think it'd be a great way that we could maybe do that. So if people think that that would be a good shout, then please reach out to me and let me know. And if we get enough interest, then I'm happy to kind of put the wheels in motion on a community level kind of group for that as well.
I think that would be really helpful because Russell Group has recently released their kind of policies, but I think a lot of universities are still going quite slow in just getting people to chat with one another, to put in dialogue with one another. These, you know, no one's an expert right now. Everyone's developing their expertise, and they have been since what, November, January, February, March?
Yeah, I think with the Russell Group, I think the key thing to note there is on certainly on the release that I've seen, it's very much stated as a principle, not a policy. I think that's an important distinction to make. If there's anyone from any of those universities who've been involved in that discussion, then please feel free to kind of jump in here. But it's I think that's an important point. Around that, I think most universities, I'm putting words in lots of people's mouths here, but lots of universities do have their own kind of position on that. I think if you can, a quick Google search now will find that most universities now are kind of embracing AI, and they're trying to build resources, in a way that can help students. But I think they don't necessarily have that stamp on that guidance that says this is our policy, this is our principles on the use of AI. So I think, that's probably where lots of universities are. But I think it's been a good nudge, really, in terms of making people step back and look at what they've got, and in terms of adapting what they have going forward. And that's certainly been the case with us as well at the University of Kent. We're always trying to look at what we've got, how we need to update it to make sure it's relevant. So I'm sure that's the same with everyone else. But as I said, more than happy to have these discussions, Dustin. It's I think it's really important.
Thanks very much.